Hello, welcome to Chapter 2, The Planting of English America. Let's get started. A couple of key concepts to get us started. First of all, the English will defeat the Spanish Armada, and that'll help to encourage the colonization of the New World. Second of all, the early colonies will struggle in the New World, both with hunger and weather. A cash crop agricultural system will dominate the Chesapeake and southern colonies, and that will help lead to the use of African slavery, the plantation system. I want to say that three European powers, three global powers in their day, are going to have three settlements in North America: the Spanish at Santa Fe, the French at Quebec, and the English at Jamestown, all about the same time. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church, which launches the English Protestant Reformation. This will intensify the rivalry with Catholic Spain, and at this point, the Spanish still have the upper hand, which of course that'll change by the end of the century. Here is King Henry VIII right there, rather robust man. And here you can see the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, much of which we talked about in Chapter 1. Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII, will promote the twin goals of Protestantism and plunder. And again, this is that sort of religious conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. And that involved, in her mind at least, that involved raiding Spanish settlements and seizing treasure ships using basically state-sponsored pirates known as privateers or sea dogs. 1580, one of those sea dogs named Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. He was secretly backed by Queen Elizabeth, and she actually did knight him aboard his ship in a very brazen move. You can see that he was quite successful in terms of what kind of money he made in plundering the Spanish booty. As you can imagine, the Spanish were not very thrilled with the sea dogs plundering their ships and so forth, and so a showdown was probably inevitable. The Armada did sail into the English Channel, and unfortunately for them, they were defeated by the English. They used smaller, more maneuverable ships, and were able to rout this Spanish Armada. They also had the help of this devastating storm referred to as the Protestant Wind. So at the dawn of the 17th century, there were a lot of things happening in England that made colonization of the New World much more possible than, say, 50 years prior to that. Things we've already talked about would be the leadership of Queen Elizabeth. Again, the text does reference that people felt united behind her. In addition to that, there was the defeat of the Spanish Armada, again opening the door for colonizing the New World. There also was a population increase. I believe the text said that the population had mushroomed from 3 million to 4 million people. There was the enclosure movement, in which landlords, instead of renting land to people to farm, they began to enclose that land and use it for the grazing of sheep. Those people who previously rented now had no place to go and began to look elsewhere for work, particularly cities. There also were laws of primogeniture that were on the books, and that said that only the oldest son could inherit landed estates, so second sons and third sons had to look elsewhere for their own land. We also saw the creation of the joint stock company, and this is a forerunner to the modern corporation. So it sort of reduces the individual risk of the investor and allows the company to amass a large amount of capital. Obviously, colonizing the New World or creating a colony in the New World would cost quite a bit of money, and so the joint stock company was a way to sort of pool that capital and do that. In 1606, the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company, did receive a charter from King James I of England, and they landed in Jamestown on May 24th, 1607. We're going to actually take a look at that Virginia Company's charter in class. The colonists, began to starve, and as such, they began raiding Indian villages, which of course is going to put the damper on the relationship between these English settlers and their native neighbors. In 1608, Captain John Smith took over the town and forced the settlers into line, and his motto was, "He who shall not work shall not eat." As it goes, many of these early English settlers were gentlemen, and they were not necessarily prepared to farm and hunt and fish. I think they spent their time looking for gold. They sort of felt that gathering their own food was below them, and so Captain John Smith in 1608, he put the brakes on that. Here is King James now playing with the Lakers. You can See here, John Smith was kidnapped by Chief Powhatan. Well, Powhatan was the most dominant Native American leader in this Jamestown, Virginia region. It said in the text that the settlers of Jamestown mistakenly called all of the natives there Powhatans. And as I understand it, it was more of a loose confederation, and Chief Powhatan was just probably the best option for interacting with these newcomers. His daughter, of course, as you probably know, saved him and had put her head between the blade or the club and John Smith's head, depending on which story you hear. As I understand, this actually did happen, but in fact it was staged. It was a way to show John Smith, who would then relay that information, I'm assuming, to the settlers of Jamestown, who really was in charge. By 1609, of the 400 settlers who came to Virginia, only 60 survived the starving winter, and that is the winter of 1609 to 1610. And here is a depiction of that scene. In 1610, Lord de la Warr reached Jamestown with supplies and military aid, and the pageant refers to his arrival as sort of a declaration of war on all of the native peoples around. In fact, there are two Anglo-Powhatan wars that occur, the first of which began when the settlers were raiding and burning Indian villages. It ended with a treaty and a marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. Here's a depiction of John Rolfe on the right marrying Pocahontas. The Indians again will be defeated in the Second Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644 as tension resumed. By 1685, the English considered the Powhatan people to be extinct. So obviously in chapter 1 we talked about the Columbian Exchange and this idea that the Old World and the New World will be forever changed by the contact between the two of them. And some of that change will actually be good. I think the pageant used the word benign to say that there are new mobile lifestyles that emerge on the Great Plains. Native Americans begin to incorporate the use of horses in hunting buffalo, and it was the Spanish who had brought the horses, and so that allowed populations to thrive in a way that they did not before. An obvious example of a negative impact would be disease and its effects killing large numbers of Native Americans. And again, we talked in chapter 1 that in some places up to 90% of a particular population had been killed. And you can see here some older methods of hunting buffalo that were used. I would imagine much more dangerous than the mounted hunting style that we see here following the introduction of horses. And just to give you an example of something, you can see this is the population in Mexico, but you see how devastating disease was to that population. Now, colonies are created for the purpose of enriching the parent state. The people who started the Virginia Company went to the New World for the purpose of making money. And obviously, as we've talked about already, they're not doing that. They're starving, it's cold, there's hostile natives nearby. They're not really being all that prosperous. Well, it was John Rolfe, seen the bottom here, the same man who married Pocahontas a few slides back, who discovered a way to cure tobacco that reduced a lot of the bitterness from the smoke. And once he did that, people began to smoke tobacco more frequently, and obviously demand shot through the roof, even back in Europe. People began to plant as much tobacco as they possibly could. Literally in the streets, people were planting tobacco plants. And that's great. They made a lot of money in doing that, but there's a couple problems with that. The first of which you can see here is that their whole economy becomes tied to one single crop. So if the price of that crop is up, fantastic. If the price declines, then you have a problem. The other issue is that tobacco, and as many of these cash crop, single crop, sort of plantation systems do, it actually depletes the soil very badly. So after a few years of planting tobacco in a particular field, you just can't be productive there any longer. And so that leads to the growth of settlements and westward movement, which leads to more contact with natives and so forth. It also will become this sort of need for labor. And it says here that the plantation system emerges, but of course we'll start to see the use of African slavery by 1700 or so in large numbers. Here's the Dutch trader ship that arrived in 1620 carrying the first African slaves. I think it said in the text that in 1650, Virginia had roughly 350 Africans, and it's not very clear if these Africans were owned in perpetuity, if they were permanently slaves, or if it was for a period of time. But by the end of the century, the African population was 14%, and I believe it remained there thereafter. Put a star next to this, or highlight it, or just make note that this is important, because we're going to be talking about sort of the birth of American government and the seeds of American government. And in terms of representative government, we see the birth of that right here, and with the House of Burgesses. And again, this is an assembly. In 1619, the London Company authorized settlers to come together and discuss important matters. King James was growing more hostile towards Virginia, and as I hear it, he detested tobacco altogether. He didn't trust the House of Burgesses, and in 1624 he made Virginia a colony of England directly under his control. So it now becomes a royal colony. Here is a shot of the House of Burgesses at Colonial Williamsburg. And it will be the home of many important debates. Here is a painting depicting Patrick Henry's "If This Be Treason, Make the Most of It" speech in protest against the Stamp Act in 1765. All right, let's look at the second of the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland. It was formed in 1634 by Lord Baltimore. His goals were to make money, obviously, and also to create a refuge for Catholics. They also grew tobacco, again, very similar climate and soil and so forth, so the plant thrived there. And they utilized indentured servants for labor, at least early on, as did Virginia. Indentured servants were people who left England. They signed a contract for usually 3 to 7 years or so, and they worked as an agricultural laborer. Upon the completion of that time frame, whatever that was, they then were free to go about their business, and in fact, the person they worked for typically provided for them maybe some land or tools or even some cash. In 1676, there is a rebellion known as Bacon's Rebellion, in which former indentured servants actually rose up in rebellion, and that is sort of a watershed movement, or moment, excuse me, where people begin to turn more towards black slave labor. In 1649, the Act of Toleration granted toleration to all Christians, but it did say that those who deny the divinity of Jesus, so atheists, Jewish people, they were actually facing the death penalty for that. So it's not so tolerant, it's really just tolerant for Christians. And here is the Chesapeake Bay. So again, you hear Chesapeake colonies, we're talking about Virginia and Maryland, not Delaware. Block out Delaware. So by the mid-17th century, England had secured its claim to several West Indian islands, and sugar will be the major crop that is grown in the Caribbean. It is, as they say, the rich man's crop as opposed to tobacco being the poor man's crop. Literally, tobacco, all you need is sort of a shovel and a garden hoe. You plant the plant and you just create a mound around it. Anybody can do that. You don't really need any equipment for it necessarily, as opposed to sugar, in which is a refined plant product. So therefore, you do need heavy machinery to do that. And I'll show you a picture of a sugar mill in a second here. But also, African slaves are going to be preferred in the growth of sugar. They were less susceptible to malaria, and therefore were a better source of labor than perhaps indentured servants, or even native labor for that. By 1700, the ratio of black slaves to white settlers in the English West Indies was 4 to 1. As a result of this heavy use of slavery, a slave code was created in 1661, the Barbados Slave Code, and that denied even the most basic fundamental rights to slaves. It sort of becomes the foundation for the treatment of slaves and the status of slaves in what becomes the continental United States. Here's a sugar mill. For our purposes, we don't necessarily need to know about the Civil War in England in the 1640s or Charles II and the restoration of the throne. But in the 1670s, the Carolinas will be developed as a place to grow foodstuffs to support the sugar islands. That's what it said in the text. At least I'm assuming they're going to grow food for everybody that they can, but specifically the sugar islands were referenced in the text. And rice will become the staple crop of Carolina. African slaves, again, will be extensively used for agricultural labor. Again, I'd put a star next to this. This is another trend that we'll see, sort of reoccurring pattern as we study American history, specifically westward expansion. You see, in the original Carolina, there was this aristocratic flair. Wealthy people had settled there, and if you've been to, say, Charleston, then perhaps you know what I'm talking about. Many people who were poorer or somewhat outcasts, they actually had out in the frontier region, and they began to squat on land that is outside their chartered domain. That is, they just claim it as theirs. They don't really have any legal claim to it. But this is the trend: is that there is sort of a new Western people, a new interest that emerges that's in the frontier that's not necessarily in line with the Eastern interests. 1712, North Carolina officially separated from South Carolina, and both became royal colonies. All right, Georgia is founded much later in 1733. It's a royal colony from the onset. A man named James Oglethorpe will be the leading figure there. It was designed to be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the French Louisiana and the other English colonies. It also was designed to house convicts. I guess Oglethorpe had seen one of his friends die in a debtor's prison back in England, I'm assuming. And so it is sort of a very different colony. The plantation economy actually grew very slowly there, as you can see, because there were initial restrictions on the use of slavery, and there was constant attacks, or somewhat of constant attacks, by the Spanish. All right, so collectively, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia are all these plantation colonies. We do use the term Chesapeake colonies for Maryland and Virginia specifically, don't forget that. And all of these colonies will be exporting commercial agricultural products, cash crops, right? Tobacco, rice, later cotton as well. All of these colonies, although North Carolina not as much, utilize slavery on plantations. And the dominant faith in these colonies will be the Church of England. It is supported by tax dollars, so even if you don't belong to the Church of England, you are on the hook to pay for it. These colonies did permit some degree of religious toleration, however. And another thing to put a big star next to, and it sort of goes along with something I said just a few slides before, is that these cash crops do lead to soil depletion, or soil butchery is a term that is used, I believe, in the framework. And if you deplete the soil, you need to get more soil to continue to grow your product. And so that soil, of course, will always be in the West. And we see a lot of conflict, first with natives, but later between the states, as we have to discuss what will we do with the institution of slavery. Will slavery make its way into the frontier? That's the crux of the fight between the northern and southern states in the mid-19th century. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed chapter 2. 2 down, 40 more to go. Don't forget, it'll be fun. Take care.